In the last episode, we discussed what happens when desires replace discipline. We reflected on how emotional impulsiveness, constant distraction, and lack of self control slowly destroy inner balance. And we said something important. A community cannot become ummatan wasatan if individuals themselves are emotionally unstable and internally undisciplined. But today, we move to another serious consequence of abandoning balance. Not simply the crisis of discipline, but the crisis of direction. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. One of the strangest realities of our time is this. Many Muslims still possess identity, but no longer possess direction. They know who they are, but they do not know where they are going. There is emotion, there is outrage, there are slogans, there are debates, but very often there is no long-term vision, no intellectual seriousness, no disciplined ambition, no civilizational thinking. And this creates a dangerous emptiness because identity without purpose eventually becomes frustration. Today, many Muslims feel angry about the condition of the Ummah. But anger alone cannot build anything. Civilizations are not built by emotion alone. They are built by knowledge, discipline, contribution, excellence, sacrifice, and long-term thinking. And this is precisely what much of modern culture is destroying. We live in an age designed to distract human beings. Everything competes for attention, notifications, entertainment, endless scrolling, short videos, constant stimulation, and slowly people lose the ability to focus deeply. This is not a small problem. A distracted generation cannot build civilization because meaningful achievement requires sustained effort. But distraction trains people to seek instant gratification instead of long-term growth. This affects education, career building, reading habits, spiritual growth, even relationships. Many people today consume enormous amounts of content, but develop very little depth. They know headlines, but not knowledge. Opinions, but not understanding. Emotion, but not wisdom. And unfortunately, even religious engagement sometimes becomes shallow. A person may consume endless Islamic clips, but rarely sit with the Quran quietly, rarely study deeply, rarely develop intellectual discipline. Islam was never meant to create passive consumers. It was meant to produce thoughtful, contributing human beings. One of the greatest tragedies is that many Muslims now see religion only as identity, not mission, not responsibility, not contribution. But Islam constantly pushes believers toward purposeful living. The Quran repeatedly calls upon human beings to think, reflect, observe, learn, travel, build, and contribute. The early Muslims did not simply preserve faith emotionally. They transformed the world intellectually, economically, scientifically, spiritually, and socially. Why? Because Islam gave them direction. They understood that worship was not isolation from life. Worship was supposed to shape how a person lives, works, thinks, builds, and contributes. Faith should produce contribution, not passivity. One of the major crises today is slogan-based identity. People feel emotionally attached to Islam, but often lack productive engagement with the world. There is enormous discussion about problems, but very little preparation to solve them. Very little skill development, very little economic vision, very little reading culture, very little intellectual investment. And this creates a painful contradiction. People want dignity without excellence. They want influence without preparation. They want change without discipline. But Allah created this world with laws. Civilizations rise through effort, knowledge, organization, and sacrifice. Even spiritually, Islam teaches ihsan, excellence, not mediocrity. The Prophet Muhammad said that Allah loves when a person performs something with excellence. That includes work, study, business, leadership, character, and service to society. But when entertainment becomes dominant, ambition weakens, and eventually people become spectators in history instead of contributors to history. Another consequence of abandoning balance is intellectual laziness. Reading becomes difficult, concentration becomes difficult, deep thinking becomes difficult. Everything must become shorter, faster, simpler, more entertaining. But serious civilizations are built by serious minds. The Quran itself constantly invites reflection, not superficial reaction, reflection, tadabbur, contemplation. And this is deeply important because the person who cannot think deeply becomes easy to manipulate emotionally. This is one reason outrage spreads so easily today. People react instantly without verification, without context, without reflection. And social media amplifies this weakness. Algorithms reward emotional intensity, not wisdom. So Muslims must consciously protect their intellectual discipline. Read deeply, study carefully, think critically, develop skills patiently. Otherwise, emotional energy remains directionless. And directionless emotion eventually become frustration. Another major problem today is short-term thinking. Many people want immediate results in everything. Immediate success, immediate influence, immediate recognition. But meaningful achievement, my dear, takes years and years, sometimes even decades. Look at the life of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The Meccan period alone lasted 13 years. Years of patience, teaching, character building, spiritual development. Real transformation takes time. But modern culture trains people to become impatient. And impatience destroys consistency. A person starts learning something, then quits quickly. He starts building a skill, then loses focus. He starts reading, then returns to distraction. This instability slowly destroys potential. And perhaps one of the biggest losses in the Muslim world today is wasted potential. So many intelligent young Muslims, but without direction, without mentorship, without discipline, without long-term vision. When a community loses ambition and productivity, dependence increases. Economic dependence, intellectual dependence, technological dependence, and eventually even psychological dependence. This is dangerous because Islam encourages strength and self-sufficiency. The Prophet Muhammad taught the importance of honest work, trade, contribution, and dignity. But many Muslims today have unconsciously accepted passivity. They consume more than they create, react more than they build, complain more than they contribute, and this creates helplessness. Remember, a civilization cannot survive mere on emotional energy. It requires productive capacity. It requires builders, teachers, researchers, writers, entrepreneurs, thinkers, professional, ethical leaders. This too is part of being ummatan wasatan. So how do we begin rebuilding direction? First, Muslims must reconnect faith with purpose. Islam is not merely something we defend emotionally. It is something we are supposed to embody productively. Second, we must rebuild discipline around knowledge. Reading again, studying again, thinking again, learning skills again. Third, Muslims must develop long-term thinking. Not everything meaningful happens quickly. And finally, we must move from performance to contribution. Not simply appearing passionate, but becoming useful. Useful to family, useful to society, useful to humanity. Because the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ taught that the best people are those most beneficial to others. If this ummah wants dignity again, it cannot survive on identity alone. Identity without direction eventually becomes frustration. Muslims must rediscover what? Purpose, ambition, excellence, intellectual seriousness, and productive contribution. Because Islam was never meant to produce passive spectators. It was meant to produce builders of civilization, rather great civilization. And perhaps one of the deepest questions a Muslim must ask today is this: what am I contributing? Not merely, what am I feeling? Because emotions alone cannot revive an ummah. But disciplined, purposeful, God-conscious human beings definitely can. May Allah make us people of purpose, people of contribution, people of excellence, and people who truly embody the balanced spirit of ummatan wasatan. Wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.